Hey guys, in this video I make a knife out of an old file. A couple weeks ago I picked up a bundle of 5 from my local Goodwill store over here. Files are decent steel, they keep a good edge. So if you come across any, garage sales, consignment stores, pick them up because they make some decent knives. First thing you're going to have to do when you get started is anneal, because the file's in a hardened state. You want to get the file up to critical temperature, and you'll know that when it loses its magnetism. So keep a magnet nearby and then periodically check it. Pull it out of the forge and check it. Once it reaches that temperature, you want it to cool down as slowly as possible. Now I'm using vermiculite here. Vermiculite acts as an insulator, which allows the cooling process to be slowed. You can also just shut your forge down and let it cool as the forge cools down. That's another way. So I'm just marking out the outline right now. Not exactly written in stone. I could change it a little bit as I'm grinding. Measure for the handle. And the mark I just made there is going to be where the ricasso is. And it also allows me to separate the blade from the handle. Another thing too, after you anneal it, get another file, drag it across that, and it should make some gouges. If it doesn't, you know you were successful in the annealing. You can use a hacksaw to remove this excess material if you don't have a right angle grinder. This particular knife is going to be 9.5 inches long. It's 1 inch wide, and the material is 3/16 inch thick. Now I'm cleaning it up further on my belt grinder. I have an 80 grit belt on there right now. You can actually remove all the texture if you want. I don't, because then you lose some of the thickness of the knife. And I also like to leave some of the texture. Well, you're not going to see it in this knife because I'm going to take the grind all the way to the spine. You will see some of the leftover file on the ends where the handle is. And here's that divot I was talking about where the ricasso is going to be. And again, if you don't have a die grinder, you can use a rat tail file to do the job also. Here I'm doing the pin layout. I mark in 1/2 inch from both ends, from where the end of the handle is going to be by the ricasso, and then from the other end. And then I mark in 1/2 inch because the blade is 1 inch wide, or the file's 1 inch wide. And take her over to the drill press and drill the holes for the pins. Okay, here I'm going to mark the center line so that I know where to stop the bevel. I'm using a Sharpie. You don't have to. It just makes it a little easier to see. You can use layout fluid if you have it. Nail polish works. So I just got my caliper set to midway and just mark the center line. And I start grinding the bevel. I'm using a jig here. When I first started out, excuse me, I attempted doing it freehand. My patience just wasn't there, so I switched over to using jigs. Now I have 4 different jigs. Each has a different angle. The jig you're going to use and the angle you're going to use is going to depend on a couple things. One is going to depend on how high you want that grind to go. And it's also going to depend on the thickness of the material. If you're using 1/4 inch material, there's one jig you might not be able to use, because if you don't want the grind to go all the way to the spine, you have to compensate for that and get a less of an angle. I've got an 80 grit belt on my grinder right now. And you'll see here in a minute, I believe I switch over to a 120. I'm not going any higher in grit because the customer wants a satin finish on the blade, which I'm really happy about. I prefer putting satin finishes on blades, especially an everyday or a hunting knife. I just think it's more practical and it's a personal preference. Now here's where I'm switching over to the other belt. These jigs do another thing too. They allow you to make both sides uniform, so that when you look at them, it's a mirror. You can see there how I took the grind all the way up to the spine. So for the handle material, I'm going to go with some black micarta. I made this micarta years ago, and this is the last piece I have. It's just enough for the for this knife. Now I'm scribing lines, but I'm going to cut on the outside of the line. You want to make sure you leave the handle material larger than the steel. You can always take material off. You can't add any, so just keep that in mind. And over to my bandsaw to cut everything out. I like micarta for a couple of reasons. I mean, it's very durable. You can leave it in a rougher. It can stay rough, or you can actually polish it, shine it, sand it down to where you get it nice and smooth. Okay, so here I've just finished heat treating it. Again, you get it up to critical temperature. When it loses its magnetism, then you can quench. I'm quenching in vegetable oil. I've always had good luck with it. I'm sure you could quench in water, but because it's an unknown steel, I feel safer and I'm more confident in the quench if I use oil. Okay, now I'm over drilling the pins in the scales. What I do is I clamp it. I drill the first pin, and then I stick a pin in there, and then I can remove the clamp. It holds it in place. Then I'll just hold it secure by my hand, drill the second pin, put another pin in there, so now I have 2 pins in, and then I'll drill the middle pin. Now I'm drilling the other scale. I'm doing it the same process, but I'm not using the file. There you go. Now they're done. Take it over to the bench and do a dry run, a dry fit. You could drill these by hand. The only caution I have for you is that you got to make sure that you're going straight in, because if it's off a little bit, that pin will not go in. You're going to have to beat it in with a hammer, and it's just, you're fighting it all the way, especially when you go to epoxy the scales on. Now this mark here is going to be exact. I'm going to cut on the line a little bit away from it because I have some sanding to do. And the reason for that is the two ends of the scales that are closest to the ricasso, you're going to want to finish prior to gluing or epoxying them onto the handle. Once they're epoxied onto the handle, it's harder to get to them. You know, you can use a file, but the problem is you risk the chance of scratching the steel. You certainly don't want to do that, especially after all the work you just put into it. So I'll cut it closer than what I did when I was cutting the length. Now here I'm taking off the rough edges. Again, this is the end that's going to be closest to the ricasso. I have 120 grit belt on this grinder. That's a different grinder than the other one. So I got it real close to where I want it, and I switched over. I got some 180 grit, and it's time for a little bit of hand work. I switched as high as I go is 220. Once that's done, we're ready to epoxy the scales on. Make sure when you are going to epoxy the scales on that make sure that everything is right in reach of you. Off camera, I also have a bottle of acetone to do, if there's any cleanup that's necessary. 9 times out of 10, you're going to have cleanup. I'm using JB epoxy, 5-minute setup time. So I put the 2 end pins in, and then I'll epoxy the other side, and then I'll add the 3rd pin. Look at that, I almost put it on upside down. Glue side down, remember that. Once all 3 pins are set, I'm going to use 3 C-clamps to hold it secure. And then because my shop is not heated 24/7, it gets cold out here. I'm in Northeast Ohio. So I will take it in the house and let it cure. Even though it says 5-minute or a 15-minute epoxy, let it cure for 24 hours. Don't go messing with it, because when you start grinding, it's going to heat the blade up, And if it isn't fully cured, you're going to loosen up the scales. Here I'm cutting off the excess pin. Move over to the bandsaw and I'm cutting off the excess micarta as close as I can get. Also, too, what I forgot to mention is when you're putting that bevel on, make sure you leave material at the cutting edge. A 1/16 of an inch, a little bit more, because if you don't and then you go to heat treat it, you stand a greater chance of that area warping. Now here I'm cleaning up the profile. Still have my 80 grit belt on. And like I said, I'll switch to a 120 here in a minute. So I'm going to do some hand work on the blade to get some of those scratches out and get that satin finish. Started off with 120 and I go as high as 220 and then that's it. I just think the satin finish has a really nice look. Again, my preference. By the way, these clips are sped up, I believe, 2 times normal. A couple sections I have it sped up a little bit more. I was trying to keep the video, you know, at a decent length. Now I'm putting the final edge on. I used the slack part of the belt. And I started off with 180. And I worked my way up to what's on there now, which is a 400 grit. Now in this video I don't do it, but I'll do hand work as far as using a whetstone, and then the final thing I'll do is I'll strop it. If you want to see that process, I have a video where I make a railroad spike knife, and I go into more detail as far as the sharpening goes. And there you have it. There's the finished product. Turned out nice. Hopefully the customer likes it. Well, there you have it, fellas. I appreciate and gals. I'm gonna correct myself there. I appreciate you guys watching. Check out some of my other videos. I don't have very many, but check them out. Subscribe. Thanks, guys. Catch you next time.